Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank him and the ranking member for bringing this legislation to the floor. It's so appropriate that it is bipartisan because it is about American values. And I rise to join you to pass H.R. 35, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which finally explicitly designates lynching as a federal hate crime. More than a century ago, the first anti-lynching legislation was introduced and later passed by this House to, in quotes, to assure to persons within the jurisdiction of every state the equal protection of the laws and to punish the crime of lynching. But over 100 years and 200 attempts later, passage is still not law. I salute Congressman Bobby Rush. I know Bobby Scott has something to do with this as well, but in this case, the leadership of Bobby Rush, a lifelong civil rights champion in the Congress and in our country, for his leadership on H.R. 35, which will right this historic wrong. Thank you to Chairwoman Karen Bass of the Congressional Black Caucus for her commitment and that of the entire Congressional Black Caucus for bringing this legislation to the floor. And thank you, Chairman Nadler and Mr. Ranking Member, for your leadership as well. And I thank Senators Cory Booker and Kamala Harris leading this legislation in the Senate. Today, Congress has an opportunity to acknowledge its responsibility for its historic failure to confront and end the horror of lynching in America. We must begin by acknowledging the heartbreaking truth that racially motivated acts of terror have long been a part of American history and that they remain a stain on our nation's soul today. We must never forget the massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina, 122 years ago, in which 60 Black Americans were brutally murdered. The race massacre in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, 100 years ago, next year, called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The mutilation and murder of Emmett Till, for whom this legislation is named, a 14-year-old boy, just a boy, 65 years ago, one of the most appalling acts of racial violence in our history, forever seared in our collective memory. And we must remember the victims of more than 4,000 other lynchings and countless other acts of racial terror perpetuated through our nation's history. As recent events remind us, racially motivated violence and other forms of violence and hate targeting vulnerable communities are not a relic of the past. When a white supremacist guns down 9 parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina at Mother Emanuel, one of America's oldest African-American congregations, when neo-Nazis and white nationalist mobs carry tiki torches through Charlottesville in broad daylight, taking an innocent life, when a domestic terrorist murders 22 innocent souls in El Paso after penning a racist anti-Latino screed on the internet, when an anti-Semitic murder kills 11 innocent men and women engaged in peaceful prayer at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, we cannot deny that racism, bigotry, and hate still exist in America. As members of Congress and as Americans, we have a responsibility to acknowledge the horrors of the past so that we can never have them occur again. And as Ida B. Wells, the crusading journalist, anti-lynching advocate, and founding member of the NAACP said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." This legislation will not erase the stain of lynching and racist violence, but it will help shine the light of truth on the injustices of the past so that we can heal our nation and build a better, safer future for all of our children. In just over a week, many members will travel to Selma, Alabama to observe 55 years since the March for Freedom. With the passage of this bill, we can make that pilgrimage, praying at the Brown Chapel AME Church and marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with dignity, respect, and honor. I urge a unanimous vote for H.R. 35. Again, thank the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership and yield back the balance of my time.
Welcome to another edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. You just heard the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, giving a speech earlier this year, February the 26th, 2020, on the floor of the House in support of the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. And she was urging everybody to pass this unanimously. It almost went through unanimously. It was 410 yes and 4 no. But this bill has not yet been passed in the Senate. Why not? I'll have an answer or two for you when I return. Welcome back. It is Thursday, June the 4th, 2020. Why hasn't Congress made lynching a hate crime? As I was saying to you before the break, Speaker Pelosi, back in February, as you heard, made a call urging people from the House floor to pass this bill unanimously in the House. They almost did. Not quite. They almost did. Only 4 people stood in the way of unanimity. And those 4 people, just for the record, in case you would like to know, and I'm sure you would, Independent Justin Amash, who recently abandoned any bid for the White House as a libertarian. Republicans, Thomas Massie. Now, Massie was one of the Republicans, in fact, the only person. In fact, he was the only person from either party who voted against the stimulus bill in March, late March of this year. So he is by nature a contrarian, very bizarre guy, and essentially a libertarian as well. But he is a Republican. For all intents and purposes, that's what it says next to his name, an R. Massie is the guy that made everybody, I don't know if you remember this, but Massey is the guy that made everybody fly across the country back into D.C. to vote. He was the one person who wanted to come in, and it required a unanimous consent that everybody stay home and vote remotely. That's what was going to happen. There was going to be unanimous vote by decree so that everybody could have voted literally from their homes in a unanimous consent vote. But Thomas Massie didn't want that. He wanted during a pandemic to force everybody to drag their backsides back to Capitol Hill and inside the House chamber. And so that's exactly what happened. You had all of this chaos, I tell you, all of this chaos caused by one despicable human being. Thomas Massie, in the middle of a pandemic, in the month of March of 2020, forced everybody to fly in to Washington, D.C. For some, it was a short walk because some had stayed in Washington, but for the overwhelming majority of people, Congress people, it was on your bike, get on a plane, and fly your backside over here. That's what Thomas Massie did. So what happened was a protracted vote happened. And what happened was that people were voting. Some of them wore face masks. Some of them didn't. Guess who didn't wear face masks? And there were rounds of voting, and you had people waiting and voting in groups. And because of the social distancing policies, it took forever. But around, what was it? Maybe 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock. I don't remember the exact time. The House voted on the stimulus bill in March, right near the end of the month, about a week or so before the end of the month or whenever it was, and it got passed. And Massey was the only one who voted no. So why, Massey, did you force everybody to come in just so that you could record your no vote in person when you could have done it from your home state? Kentucky. And I'll tell you why Kentucky is noteworthy in a moment. So, Massey votes no on this stimulus. He's the only person in the House that voted no on this stimulus bill. Of course it passed, but he's the only blot on that record. And so he's one of the only blots on this anti-lynching bill. Thomas Massey, Louis Gohmert, well, that's predictable, another racist from Texas, and Ted Yoho, another racist. I think he's from out here in California, not out here, but he is California representative, Republican. So 4 people, Amash, Massey, Gohmert, and Yoho, were the only 4 people that voted against the anti-lynching bill. The debate was pretty clear. It took about 40 minutes for them to debate, culminating in that speech that I just played you from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. This bill was passed in the House on February the 26th of this year. By the way, we didn't know it then. At least most people outside of Georgia didn't know it then. But only 3 days before that, 3 days before, you just heard the Speaker of the House talking about lynching and murders of black people, lynchings of black people, and how much lynching continues. Of course, you know about George Floyd. But only 3 days before this very bill was passed in the House, Ahmaud Arbery was lynched by 3 white racists in Georgia, in Brunswick, Georgia. Videotape of that, of course, has gone around. So unbeknownst to everybody, pretty much everybody in that House chamber, except for the constituents in Georgia, the representatives from Georgia, unbeknownst to everybody else, or most others, Ahmaud Arbery had been lynched 3 days before this bill passed. But I want to get to the main idea here is why this bill has not been passed in the Senate. And by the way, as Speaker Pelosi alluded to in her speech, an incredible, unbelievable 200 plus times this bill had been up for passage. 200 plus. This has been going back well over 150 years that Congress has been trying, and I put the word trying in quotes, air quotes, trying to pass an anti-lynching law bill, an anti-lynching law. Why hasn't Congress made that a hate crime yet? You would have thought that after the abolition of enslavement of black people in this country, you would have thought that after the Civil Rights Act, after the Voting Rights Act, you would have thought that after the end of the Civil War, that this country, the United States of America, and its Congress specifically, would have found a way to pass an anti-lynching law. But that has not happened, which makes this really troubling to me. And it should trouble you too, especially when you have all of these police killings of black people in this country that are tantamount to lynchings. When you say that word to people, some of them cringe, and that's understandable. But many have an instant thought about a rope being involved. Well, I'm here to tell you that lynchings do not have to have any rope anywhere in the area code. It is about the brutal manner of taking a life in a very brutally violent way, which is the same as a lynching, obviously. There is one human being who is holding up the anti-lynching law in the Senate. And the person is from Kentucky, just like Thomas Massey, that Republican who voted against the stimulus package back in March of this year and had everybody come into the House chamber, fly all the way from across the country in some cases just to vote when they could have done it remotely from home. The one person who is from Kentucky who's holding this bill up on the Senate side is, guess who? You'd be wrong for thinking that it was Mitch McConnell. Oh, no, it's not Mitch McConnell holding this up. It's the junior senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. Rand Paul, a.k.a. Sniveling Gutter Snipe, is holding up this anti-lynching law from being passed in the Senate. I'm going to read something here, and it's fairly lengthy, and I'm going to get through it for you. It is in the National Journal at nationaljournal.com, and it's written by Zach, Z-A-C-H, Zach Cohen, C-O-H-E-N. It is called Why Congress Hasn't Made Lynching a Hate Crime. There was just 40 minutes of debate about this in the House back in February. 40 minutes. This is during the pandemic, which we still, of course, are going through. We are still in the first wave of that pandemic here in the United States. And still, here on June 4th, 2020, we are without an anti-lynching law. We still don't have that in this country. And you would have thought by now that we would. Here's the article, and I'm going to read it right now. Again, it's from the National Journal, dated June the 2nd of this year, written by Zach Cohen. The title again, Why Congress Hasn't Made Lynching a Hate Crime. It was supposed to be historic. In the twilight of Black History Month, the House voted overwhelmingly to finally make lynching a federal hate crime. Supporters expected it to swiftly pass the Senate that had unanimously backed similar measures and send it to Donald Trump's desk. But then all action screeched to a halt as supporters looked to fast-track the uncontroversial measure by unanimous consent. Libertarian Senator Rand Paul put a hold on the bill, according to sources familiar with the negotiations. Quote, Senator Paul is working with the sponsors of the bill to make it stronger, end quote. A Paul spokesman said Tuesday when asked about the hold. Paul's office didn't elaborate on his objections. Senator Cory Booker, a top supporter of the anti-lynching legislation, told Sirius XM host Joe Madison in early March that an unnamed senator held up the bill because they wanted an amendment, quote, around the language of the federalization of the crime. Quote, I don't think that he, Paul, has clearly articulated his opposition publicly, Madison said in an interview Tuesday. In the 3 months after Paul halted the legislation, a viral pandemic swept the globe and the nation. Violence has racked America's cities as protesters take to the streets, demanding justice for the death of unarmed African Americans at the hands of white people. The effort to tackle lynching has a tortuous history in Washington. Congress has failed to pass anti-lynching legislation 200 times since 1882, when 49 black Americans were lynched. In the past century and a half, racists used it as an instrument of terror more than 4,000 times, according to the non-profit Equal Justice Initiative. Quote, "This has been decades in the making, and it is remarkable that we have gone this long in our country without declaring lynching a federal crime," end quote, said Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Quote, "And today's communities continue to wrestle with racial violence in many forms," end quote. The latest effort, led by the Senate's 3 black members, Booker, Kamala Harris, and Tim Scott, seemed destined for passage. Harris introduced the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act on Valentine's Day in 2019, and it passed the Senate by voice vote. The same bill had passed the Senate in June 2018. We have an opportunity once again to right this wrong and face the ugly history of lynching in America, Harris said in a floor speech at the time. Let's recall this stain on America's history. Lynching is an act of terror. It is murder. The measure was quickly referred to the House, where it stalled for over a year. Rather than take up the Senate-approved bill, the House opted for Democratic Representative Bobby Rush's competing but similar bill titled the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Rush had introduced the measure a month before Harris did, and it passed the House 410-4 on February 26th. "I wanted to put Emmett's imprimatur on this," Rush said in a brief interview at the time, referencing the 14-year-old Mississippian who became a civil rights icon after he was lynched in 1955. That created some consternation over in the Senate, where Scott noted the title change would create delays. To be frank, I think they wanted their fingerprints on it. They wanted to be a House bill, Scott, the lone black Republican in the Senate, told National Journal in February. So they changed the title and kept every other syllable, sentence, and letter in it. We got it passed twice. Now we have to do it again. I think we would have been better off just keeping it as it was and sending it to Donald Trump's desk so we could get it done immediately. I hope that doesn't disrupt it, Scott added. The day after the House vote, supporters were confident the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act would pass the Senate, and supporters hotlined the bill in hopes of getting unanimous consent for a third time. How dare any of them object, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said at the time, seated next to Booker, Harris, and Rush. Also present were relatives of Emmett Till, Ollie Gordon, and her daughter, Arika Gordon Taylor, the executive director of the Mamie Till Mobley Foundation, named in honor of Emmett's mother. That's the Mamie Till Mobley Memorial Foundation. But the Senate adjourned February 27th without adopting the measure, and Black History Month ended without action to make lynching a federal crime. Gordon Taylor died weeks later. It breaks my heart that she passed, not getting to see this bill reach the finish line, Clark said. The fact there may be one man who prevented her from seeing that bill signed into law is very unsettling. Talks continued behind the scenes before the Senate went on an extended pandemic-induced recess. April and May passed without action as Congress grappled with the economic fallout of COVID-19, which forced the closure of the nation. In May, civil rights activists like Clark began to point the finger directly at Paul. The only conclusion I can draw from Senator Paul's sudden opposition to the bill is that he has an issue with the law being named after Emmett Till, which would be utterly shameful, to say the least, Rush said in a statement to National Journal on Tuesday. In the face of the recent lynchings that have taken the lives of Ahmaud Arbery and others, it defies reason that anyone would be opposed to swiftly enacting this critically needed legislation. The push to pass the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act gained steam after the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery, a black Georgia man, by two white men who have since been arrested and charged with felony murder and aggravated assault under state law. Lee Merritt, an attorney for Arbery's family, told CNN late last month that the Justice Department was investigating the shooting as a hate crime. The failure of 3 district attorneys in Georgia to bring charges against the 2 white men who killed Ahmaud Arbery demonstrates more clearly than ever why this law needs to be enacted now, tweeted Rebecca Kavanaugh, a civil rights attorney. As Washington and the nation's cities prepare for another night of protests and violence over the death of George Floyd under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer, lynching is still not designated a hate crime. This is a perfect time, said Madison, a longtime advocate for anti-lynching legislation. If people are sincere about what they're expressing in reference to George Floyd's murder, Arbery in Georgia, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, and hundreds before them, then there's no better time than to pass this bill. Well said, Joe Madison, and well done, Zach Cohen. A really good story here in the National Journal, and it's entitled once again, Why Congress Hasn't Made Lynching a Hate Crime. Shame on you, Rand Paul. Shame on you. What I suggest you do is contact the office of Senator Rand Paul. And in an episode literally that I did yesterday, I asked you to call both senators from Kentucky. And I'm going to ask you to call Rand Paul for the second consecutive episode. Please call Rand Paul. 202-225-3121. That is the Congressional Switchboard. You call that phone number and then you will be asked or greeted by a voice, and then you will just have to give the name of the senator to the operator who answers. In this case, you give the name Rand Paul. You want to speak to Rand Paul, you'll probably not get him. It's almost next to no chance of that. And you will get an aide or you will get an answering machine. Make sure you let Rand Paul or his staffer or the voicemail box, if it's not full, what you think of them and what you think of him specifically, what you think of the fact that he is holding up a lynching law, anti-lynching law. Can you make sure that you do let him know what your thoughts and feelings are about this? Let his aide know. There is no excuse for this, by the way. There's no excuse for Rand Paul to hold this bill up. This is an affront to everybody in this country, especially to black people, but it is an affront to everybody. It is an affront to every decent person in this country. Rand Paul is a psychopath. Rand Paul is a sociopath. But call him at 202-225-3121. He's also on Twitter. So please do your duty and call Rand Paul or tweet Rand Paul. You can go search for him on Twitter. I think it's Rand Paul, R-A-N-D, Rand, R-A-N as in Nancy, D as in dog, Paul, and you know how to spell Paul, I'm sure you do. I hope you do. And it's either Rand Paul or Senator Rand Paul or whatever, but you can find him on Twitter. Tweet him. Call him. Ask his staffers or leave a message asking why is he holding up this bill. And more than that, urge him to vote and let this bill go through so that we can actually have federal protections against lynching, making it a hate crime, which is what I think should have been done a long time ago, especially now when we've got black person after black person after black person being murdered by the police, being lynched by the police. We had David McAtee this week. There have been others that we don't even know of, at least they have not been familiar. There was a killing by a cop of a black man in Seattle in March. I wonder if anybody really cares. Rand Paul must be voted out whenever he's next up for re-election. But in the meantime, please do call his office at 202-225-3121. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.